The fans, the audience, the people. You could argue that MMA just isn't the same without the fans being right there watching. Fans chanting for the favorites, fans chanting for the underrated underdog, and of course the cacophony of boos and trash talk from the dudes in the audience who think they could survive 1 minute against a pro MMA fighter. Fans have gone too far in the past, however, doing stuff they really shouldn't and getting the entire MMA community against them. For this video, however, we're talking about times when the whole MMA crowd and audience got unbelievably mad. Before we get to the meat of the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more videos on the coolest sports content. UFC Mexico. Mexico has long been an untapped market for the UFC and MMA. Mexico is home to some of the best boxers in the world, so it was a no-brainer that a UFC event in Mexico could just be what we need to get more events for the fans in this untapped market. Fans were hyped for this event, especially after learning that two of the best MMA fighters with Mexican roots were in the main event, Yair Rodriguez and Jeremy Stephens, as well as a bunch of other MMA fighters with Latin American origins were going to be there. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the extremely hyped main event fight ends in just 15 seconds with a no contest of all things as Rodriguez lands an eye poke on Stephens. Despite all the medical attention and stalling, Rodriguez could not open his eyes, and just like that, the event is over in the most unsatisfying way possible. Suffice it to say, fans were definitely not happy. As a riot ensued, commentators had to hide underneath tables as fans threw chairs, bottles, and everything else they could at the octagon. Best Bang hilariously compares it to another rowdy MMA crowd moment that we'll get into later. Safe to say, this wasn't quite the welcome the UFC wanted, and UFC Mexico left such a bad impression, so much so that this event's aftermath is probably the reason why the MMA is still yet to return to Mexico all these years later. Fans versus the referee. Whether we're talking MMA, basketball, football, baseball, hockey, boxing, heck, probably even lacrosse, referees are the absolute worst part of any live sporting event. We get it, refs are human. They make mistakes and they have their biases, but that doesn't make the bad and outright wrong calls these refs do any less terrible and egregious. Especially in the world of MMA, where the last thing anyone wants is for a fighter to get seriously hurt. Well, that's what happens here, as this fight from a promotion called Thunder Fight was clearly over as soon as the fighter hit the canvas in what was a clear knockout. The crowd pretty much had to shout at the ref to do something. He then stops the fight, takes his sweet time checking the fighter out, and then for some reason, he thinks the man can still fight even after clearly getting knocked out and stands him up to continue the fight. Only after the fighter was down and knocked out again did the ref finally stop the fight. Fans were not happy and were shouting at how messed up this ref was and how he clearly did not do his job right. Fans can usually be unreasonable when they get mad, but this time around, getting angry was definitely an unexpected response towards this incompetence. Rose versus Carla. When a fight is sometimes deemed by fans as the worst title fight of all time, you know things are not good at all. That was the case when strawweight champion Carla Esparza fought against Rose Namajunas for the second time at UFC 274. The very first strawweight title fight in UFC history was actually the first Rose versus Carla fight, so there was relatively hype considering what this fight would mean to the sport. The fight had the hype, and the two just did not deliver on the hype. We understand that wildly swinging and throwing out cool kicks and grapples aren't always the smart way to win the fight. But the two fighters were simply just boring, as they refused to throw actual hits, instead preferring to keep waiting for one fighter to start getting aggressive. This fight was a boring 5-round decision, which ended with Carla getting the win by getting a few more hits in. MMA fans were not happy with the end result, so much so that even at Carla Esparza's next fight press con at UFC 281, fans were still booing and mad at the fighter for giving them a boring fight.
And I'll just say, I'm going to do everything in my power to keep this belt here in the U.S.
Which made her next opponent, Zhang Weili, completely confused that she somehow won the American crowd over without doing anything. Safe to say, MMA fans don't care as much about the end result if they know you don't deserve it. And the last thing an MMA fan would probably want is a fight with no action, which is exactly what ticked them off towards Carla Esparza. MMA versus the Queen. Let's be honest here. MMA fans boo the weirdest things, and they sometimes cheer the weirdest things. Everyone can remember all those weird times MMA fans would rather cheer for ringside girls rather than cheer for the fighters actually fighting for their entertainment. This time around, MMA fans chose something weird to boo, as the fans end up booing, of all things, a tribute to the late Queen Elizabeth II during UFC 279. Even if you aren't the biggest Queen Elizabeth II fan, did you really have to go and boo an innocent little tribute? Well, MMA fans thought so, and they also proceeded to chant USA, USA as the tribute was there. The UFC literally asked for a minute of silence, and MMA fans still found something to get mad at and troll at. Brazilian fans at UFC 283. Brazilian sports fans are at a different level of obsession. These guys treat their sports stars as deities. That's why during the UFC event in Brazil, Brazilian fans showed just how undying their love is for their Brazilian-born MMA fighters. The co-main event of this UFC bout is set in Brazil, not to mention the first live event in Brazil since COVID. Brazilian fans definitely had the back of their local-born fighter, Davison Figueiredo, as he faced off against Brandon Moreno for the flyweight title in what was the heated fourth meeting between the fighters. While Brazil fans were ecstatic and wanted nothing more than a win for Figueiredo, Moreno just had dominance and control of this fight from the get-go and gets a doctor's stoppage on Figueiredo at the end of the third round. The Brazilian fans were not happy with the result and started throwing bottles, towels, and a bunch of other things at the octagon to show they were displeased with the results. Moreno had to be covered and escorted out quickly by security or risk his safety from the cacophony of bottles thrown at him. Later on, thankfully, Moreno could talk lightly about what happened and even said he found the whole thing funny. The entire UFC and MMA community were not happy about Brazil though, and heavily reprimanded and called out the actions of the fans as it was clearly a sign of disrespect towards a fighter who simply fought hard and won. Booing crowds versus Al Iaquinta. Al Iaquinta won points from MMA fans everywhere with his post-fight press. Al Iaquinta had won tough bout by split decision. Immediately after his hard-fought win, fans everywhere started spouting off on Iaquinta with a cacophony of boos at UFN 63.
Are you guys booing me? You better not boo me!
Instead of letting the crowd off easy and just letting them boo, Iaquinta decided to speak his mind about how he felt about the crowd's booing. Safe to say he was mad that fans were really out here spoiling a fight that he fought long and hard for the win. All we can say is we have his respect for speaking his mind and telling the crowd what he thought about the booing. And that's all for today's video. What do you think is the most memorable crowd rage moment? Write your answers down in the comments, and while you're at it, leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell for notifications on the newest videos on the best sports content.